In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, a shocking letter, drenched in lavender and penned in smudged ink, surfaces after the sudden death of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, accusing a local farmer of a scandalous affair. But the letter's date is impossible, written after her death. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of deceit, uncovering a forged confession, a hidden will, and a greedy heir's desperate scheme. As secrets unravel in the shadow of lavender, the truth restores peace to a village gripped by suspicion. Chapter 1. The quiet of St. Mary Mead. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm, golden glow across the thatched roofs and tidy gardens that defined the village's timeless charm. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite wicker chair, a basket of knitting at her side, her fingers deftly working the needles with a rhythm born of habit. The roses in her garden were at their peak, their petals unfurling in a riot of pink and crimson, and a faint breeze carried the hum of bees and the distant chatter of villagers. To an outsider, it was a scene of perfect tranquility, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes, undimmed by age, caught the subtle undercurrents that rippled beneath the village's serene surface. She sipped her tea, brewed to the precise strength she preferred, and considered the morning's news, delivered by her maid, Lily, with the breathless excitement of youth. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the widowed occupant of Lavender Cottage, had been found dead in her drawing room the previous evening. The doctor, a brisk man named Dr. Haydock, had declared it a heart attack, citing Mrs. Grayson's age and delicate constitution, yet the village, ever hungry for drama, murmured otherwise. Sudden, wasn't it? Lily had said, her eyes wide, and her so particular about her health. Miss Marple had nodded, her expression mild, but her mind was already turning over the details, sifting them like pebbles in a stream. Mrs. Grayson had been a figure of quiet distinction in St. Mary Mead, a woman of 60. She had lived alone since her husband's death a decade earlier, her days filled with gardening, charitable works, and the occasional sharp-tongued letter to the parish council about the state of the footpaths. Her wealth, inherited from her husband's investments, was modest but secure, and Lavender Cottage, with its whitewashed walls and lavender-lined paths, was a testament to her refined tastes. Miss Marple, who had exchanged pleasantries with her at church, recalled her as a woman of precision, not prone to fancies or frailties. A heart attack, she mused, seemed oddly abrupt for someone so meticulous. As she set her teacup down, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the high street, where Mrs. Bantry, her friend and confidant, was approaching with a purposeful stride. Mrs. Bantry, robust and rosy-cheeked, was the wife of Colonel Bantry, and her enthusiasm for village gossip rivaled her passion for her prized dahlias. "Jane," she called, waving a gloved hand as she pushed open the garden gate. "Have you heard about poor Mrs. Grayson? Dreadful business, simply dreadful." Miss Marple smiled, inviting her friend to sit. "I've heard a little," she said, her voice soft but inviting elaboration. Mrs. Bantry needed no encouragement. Settling into a chair with a rustle of tweed, she launched into a vivid account of the discovery. Mrs. Grayson's housekeeper, Mrs. Copling, had found her employer slumped in an armchair, a cup of tea spilled across the rug. No signs of struggle, no marks of violence, yet the suddenness of it all had set tongues wagging. "And," Mrs. Bantry added, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "there's talk of a letter found at the post office. Clara says it's addressed to the vicar, but no one's seen it yet." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. A letter, she asked, her tone one of polite curiosity, though her mind was already alight with possibilities. Letters, in her experience, were rarely innocent in such circumstances. They carried secrets, accusations, or confessions, and their timing was seldom coincidental. "How very interesting," she murmured, her eyes drifting to the roses as if they held the answer. Mrs. Bantry, oblivious to the quiet calculations behind her friend's serene expression, prattled on about the village's theories poison. A jilted lover, even a curse from an old rival. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of amber, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of St. Mary Mead. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet secrets had a way of hiding in plain sight. She thought of a case from her youth, when a sudden death in a neighbouring village had unravelled into a tale of greed and deception, all sparked by a single misplaced note. Mrs. Grayson's death, she suspected, was no simple matter of a failing heart. The letter, if it existed, would be the key, or perhaps a cleverly laid trap. Rising to refill the teapot, Miss Marple made a mental note to visit the post office. Clara, the postmistress, was young and impressionable, likely to share details with a gentle nudge. As Mrs. Bantry chatted on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lavender Cottage, its scented paths, and the woman who attended them. Something was amiss, she felt certain, and the truth, like the roses in her garden, would reveal itself in time, petal by careful petal. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The morning after Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's untimely demise, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves mourned the loss or, perhaps hinted at secrets yet to be unveiled. The village, though small, thrived on its routines, and the post office, a squat building with a red-tiled roof, was the beating heart of its daily gossip. It was here, at precisely 10 o'clock, that Clara Henshaw, the young postmistress, made a discovery that would set the village ablaze with speculation. Clara, a slight girl of 22, with a penchant for romantic novels and a nervous habit of twisting her apron, had been sorting the morning's mail when she came upon an envelope that stood out from the usual bills and circulars. It was addressed to the Reverend Clement, the vicar of St. Mary Mead, in a hand that was both elegant and oddly smudged, as though the writer had been interrupted or unsteady. The envelope itself was of fine cream paper, its edges faintly scented, with lavender, a detail that made Clara's heart skip, for it reminded her of Mrs. Grayson's meticulous habits. The return address, printed neatly in the corner, confirmed her suspicion. Lavender Cottage. Clara hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope. Mrs. Grayson's death was the talk of the village, and to find a letter from her, posted the day after her passing, seemed almost uncanny. She glanced around the post office, its counter cluttered with stamps and parcels, and saw Mrs. Finch, the baker's wife, lingering by the notice board, pretending to read the parish announcements. Clara, aware that any delay would fuel gossip, slipped the letter into her apron pocket and resolved to deliver it to the vicarage herself. "It's only proper," she told herself, though her pulse quickened at the thought of its contents. The vicarage, a rambling house with ivy-clad walls, stood a short walk from the high street. Clara, clutching the envelope, knocked timidly on the door. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, answered, her round face flushed from overseeing the morning's baking. "Why, Clara, what brings you here?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. Clara, stammering slightly, explained her errand, and Mrs. Clement's eyes widened at the mention of Mrs. Grayson's name. "A letter from her. But she's— oh, do come in, dear. The vicar must see this at once. The Reverend Clement, mild-mannered man with spectacles perched on his nose, was in his study, preparing a sermon on forgiveness. He looked up as Clara and his wife entered, the envelope held between them like a fragile relic. "From Mrs. Grayson," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. He took the letter, noting its lavender scent and the smudged handwriting, and broke the seal with a paper knife. Clara and Mrs. Clement hovered, their curiosity barely contained, as he unfolded the single sheet within. The letter, written in black ink, was brief but explosive. It began with a formal salutation, "My dear Reverend," and proceeded to a confession that made the vicar's cheeks redden. Mrs. Grayson, it claimed, had engaged in a scandalous affair with Mr. Thomas Reed, a married farmer who lived at Willow Farm. The letter expressed remorse, begging the vicar to mediate with Mrs. Reed and seek forgiveness on her behalf. It was signed with Mrs. Grayson's unmistakable flourish, though the ink was blurred in places, as if tears or haste had marred the page. The date, however, was what froze the vicar's breath. It was written the day after Mrs. Grayson's death. "This cannot be," the vicar murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "Mrs. Grayson was found yesterday evening, and Dr. Haydock confirmed her passing. How could she have written this?" He looked to Clara, who shook her head, her eyes wide with confusion. Mrs. Clement, ever practical, suggested calling Constable Hargreaves, and within the hour the young policeman arrived. His notebook at the ready. Constable Hargreaves, a sturdy man with a penchant for order, read the letter with a frown. "It's irregular, sir," he said, addressing the vicar. "The date's impossible, unless the postmark's wrong." Clara, eager to prove her diligence, fetched the postbag's log, which showed the letter had been posted late the previous evening, hours after Mrs. Grayson's body was discovered. The constable scratched his head, his orderly world disrupted by this anomaly. "We'll need to speak to her nephew, Harold Grayson," he decided. "He's at the cottage now, sorting her affairs." News of the letter spread faster than a summer storm. By noon, the post office was crowded with villagers, each offering their own theory. Mrs. Finch, now at the centre of the gossip, declared it a ghost's doing, while Mr. Pye, the grocer, muttered about forgery. Miss Jane Marple, who had arrived to post a letter to her nephew, overheard the chatter and paused, her blue eyes bright with interest. She approached Clara, who was flushed from the attention, and asked, with her usual gentle tact, to see the envelope. Clara, relieved to share the burden with someone as composed as Miss Marple, handed it over. Miss Marple held the envelope to the light, noting its fine texture and the faint, unmistakable scent of lavender. The handwriting, though smudged, bore the hallmarks of care, with loops and flourishes that suggested a feminine hand yet. The smudges were curiously deliberate, clustering around key words. "How very peculiar," she said softly, her mind already weaving connections. She returned the envelope to Clara and thanked her, promising to call again. As she stepped into the street, she saw Mrs. Bantry waving from across the green, her face alight with the thrill of scandal. "Jane, have you heard?" Mrs. Bantry called, hurrying over. "A letter from Mrs. Grayson, confessing to an affair with Thomas Reed. The vicar's beside himself, and poor Margaret Reed hasn't left her house since the news broke." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. An affair was a serious charge in St. Mary Mead, where reputations were as fragile as porcelain. Thomas Reed, a bluff, hard-working farmer, was an unlikely candidate for such intrigue, and his wife, Margaret, was known for her quiet dignity. The letter, Miss Marple suspected, was not what it seemed. She recalled a conversation with Mrs. Grayson at the church fete, where the widow had spoken fondly of her late husband, a man of steady habits and deep affection. There had been no hint of restlessness in her manner, no suggestion of a wandering heart. The lavender scent, too, was significant. Mrs. Grayson's signature. Yes, but easily replicated by anyone with access to her cottage. And the smudged handwriting. Miss Marple had seen such tricks before, in a case involving a forged love letter that nearly ruined a young governess. People, she thought, are so careless with their deceptions, determined to learn more. Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to tea at the vicarage, where the letter was to be discussed further. The vicarage drawing-room was a cosy space, filled with chintz, cushions, and the scent of fresh scones. The vicar, still unsettled, showed Miss Marple the letter, now safely stored in a drawer. She examined it closely, her fingers tracing the smudges. The ink, she noted, was not uniformly blurred. Certain words, affair, forgiveness, were almost illegible, while others remained crisp. It was as if the writer had intended to obscure the meaning, or to distract from something else entirely. Reverend Miss Marple said, her voice mild, "Might I ask if Mrs. Grayson ever mentioned Mr. Reed in your presence?" The vicar shook his head, admitting that their conversations had centered on parish matters. Mrs. Clement, pouring tea, added that Mrs. Grayson had been a private woman, unlikely to confide such a scandal. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Harold Grayson, the nephew who stood to inherit Lavender Cottage. She had met him once, a nervous young man with a habit of glancing over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. His arrival in the village had coincided with Mrs. Grayson's declining health, a coincidence. Perhaps, but Miss Marple distrusted coincidences. As tea concluded, Constable Hargreaves arrived with news. Harold had been questioned and claimed no knowledge of the letter. He had, however, been seen at the post office the previous evening, posting a parcel. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A parcel?" she asked. The constable nodded, explaining that it was a small package, addressed to a London solicitor. Likely her papers, he said, but Miss Marple wondered. Papers, in her experience, were often the key to unravelling motives. She left the vicarage with a plan forming. Lavender Cottage would be her next stop, under the pretense of offering condolences. Harold, she sensed, held answers, whether he knew it or not. The lavender-scented letter, with its impossible date and smudged confessions, was a puzzle, and Miss Marple was no stranger to puzzles. As she walked home, the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of pale sunlight. The village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next revelation. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked under her arm, smiled faintly. The truth, she knew, was like a thread in her wool, tangled at first, but clear once carefully unravelled. Chapter 3. The Scent of Suspicion. The air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge the morning after the scandalous letter's discovery, as if the village itself bristled with the weight of unspoken secrets. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, set out for Lavender Cottage, her steps measured but purposeful. The high street was unusually quiet, the villagers' usual chatter subdued by the shadow of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's death and the shocking contents of her alleged confession. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by the villagers' mood. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting basket, was already piecing together the threads of this peculiar affair. Lavender Cottage stood at the end of a winding lane, its whitewashed walls glowing softly under the morning sun. The garden was a riot of lavender bushes, their purple spikes swaying gently, releasing a fragrance that clung to the air like a lingering memory. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes taking in the neatly trimmed hedges and the polished brass. Knocker on the door. Everything about the cottage spoke of Mrs. Grayson's meticulous nature, a woman who left nothing to chance. Yet something, Miss Marple sensed, had slipped through her careful grasp. The door was answered by Mrs. Coupling, the housekeeper, a stout woman with a face creased by years of service and a disposition that veered between loyalty and exasperation. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's kind of you to call. Such a dreadful time, with poor Mrs. Grayson gone." Her voice wavered, but her eyes darted toward the interior of the cottage, betraying a nervousness that Miss Marple noted with interest. "I thought I might offer my condolences," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but her gaze keen, "and perhaps see how young Mr. Grayson is managing." Mrs. Coupling hesitated, then stepped aside, ushering her into the parlour. The room was a study in order, polished furniture, a vase of fresh lavender on the table, and a faint scent that permeated every corner. Yet there was a tension in the air, as if the cottage itself held its breath. Harold Grayson, Mrs. Grayson's nephew and sole heir, was in the dining room, sorting through a pile of papers with a distracted air. He was a man in his early 30s, with a lean frame and eyes that flickered restlessly, like those of a fox caught in a trap. His suit, though well cut, was slightly rumpled, and a smudge of ink stained the cuff of his right sleeve a detail. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught immediately. He rose as she entered, his smile thin and unconvincing. "Miss Marple," he said, "how good of you to come. I'm afraid it's a bit chaotic here." "No trouble at all," she replied, settling into a chair with the ease of one accustomed to making herself at home. "It must be a great shock, losing your aunt so suddenly." Harold nodded, his fingers fidgeting with a pen. "Yes, quite sudden. Her heart, you know. Dr. Haydock said it was only a matter of time." His voice was smooth, but there was a brittleness to it, like a pane of glass about to crack. Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the mantel, where a small heirloom box caught her attention. It was an exquisite piece, carved from dark wood with intricate floral patterns, its lid inlaid with mother of pearl. She had seen it before, at a charity bazaar where Mrs. Grayson had displayed it with pride, calling it a family treasure. "Such a lovely box," Miss Marple remarked, her tone casual. "Your aunt was so fond of it." Harold's gaze followed hers, and for a moment his hand tightened on the pen. "Oh, that old thing," he said, forcing a laugh. "Just a trinket." Really, she let the subject drop, but her mind lingered on the box. In her experience, objects cherished by their owners often held more than sentimental value. She turned the conversation to the letter, mentioning it with the air of one merely curious about village gossip. "I hear there was a letter found at the post office," she said, watching Harold closely. "Quite a stir it's caused." Harold's face paled, and he set the pen down with a deliberate slowness. "Yes, I heard something about it," he said. "Some nonsense about an affair, I suppose. People will talk." His tone was dismissive, but the ink smudge on his cuff seemed to glow under Miss Marple's scrutiny. She made a mental note. Inquire further about his activities the evening the letter was posted. Mrs. Coupling, who had been hovering in the doorway, offered tea, and Miss Marple accepted, using the moment to observe the room further. The lavender scent was stronger here, emanating from sachets tucked into drawers and cushions, a habit Mrs. Grayson had maintained religiously. Miss Marple recalled a conversation at the Women's Institute where Mrs. Grayson had mentioned making her own lavender sachets, a task she undertook with almost ritualistic care. Could someone else have replicated that scent? It was a question worth pursuing. As Mrs. Copling bustled in with a tray, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Harold's plans. "Will you stay in St. Mary Mead?" she asked, her eyes soft but probing. Harold shifted uncomfortably. "Oh, I don't know," he said. "The cottage is mine now, but London's more my speed. I'll likely sell it." His haste to leave, Miss Marple thought, was telling. Inheritance often brought out the worst in people, and Harold's nervous energy suggested more than grief. After tea, Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return for the Women's Institute meeting scheduled at the cottage later that week. As she stepped into the garden, she paused to examine the lavender bushes, their fragrance mingling with the damp earth. A memory surfaced of a case in her youth where a forged document had been scented with rosewater to lend it authenticity. The lavender, she suspected, was no coincidence. It was a deliberate echo of Mrs. Grayson's habits, designed to mislead. Her next stop was the post office, where Clara Henshaw was still reeling from the morning's excitement. The post office was busier now, with villagers lingering under the pretense of buying stamps or collecting parcels. Clara, her apron twisted into knots, greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's been such a to-do," she said, her voice low. "That letter, everyone's talking about it." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanor soothing. "I'm sure it's been quite a shock, dear. Might I ask about the postmark? Was it clear?" Clara nodded, fetching the logbook to show her. The postmark, stamped the previous evening, was crisp and unambiguous, confirming the letter's impossible timing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you see who posted it?" she asked. Clara hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "Well, I wasn't on duty then, but Mr. Pye said he saw young Mr. Grayson near the postbox around 8 o'clock. He was posting something, but I couldn't say if it was the letter." Miss Marple thanked her, filing the information away. Harold's presence at the postbox, combined with the ink on his cuff, was a thread she intended to follow as she left the post office. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Bantry, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "Jane, have you been to the cottage?" she asked, her voice carrying across the street. "They say Harold's already packing up Mrs. Grayson's things, and that letter, can you believe it? Thomas Reed, of all people." Miss Marple, accustomed to her friend's exuberance, nodded calmly. "It's certainly curious," she said. "I think I shall call on the Reeds tomorrow. Mrs. Reed might need a friendly ear." The rest of the day passed quietly, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She sat in her garden, her knitting a pretext for thought, and considered the players in this unfolding drama. Harold Grayson, with his restless eyes and ink-stained cuff, was at the center of it, but his motives were unclear. Was it simply greed, or something deeper? The lavender scent, so evocative of Mrs. Grayson, suggested a calculated effort to link the letter to her. Yet the smudged handwriting hinted at a less practiced hand, and the heirloom box, why had Harold dismissed it so quickly? She thought, too, of Thomas Reed, the farmer accused in the letter. He was a man of simple habits, his days spent tending crops and livestock, his evenings with his wife, Margaret. An affair seemed out of character, but Miss Marple knew that appearances could deceive. Margaret, she recalled, was a woman of quiet strength, her hands skilled at baking and her heart fiercely loyal. The letter's accusation would wound her deeply, and Miss Marple resolved to tread carefully when she visited Willow Farm as the sun dipped below the horizon. Casting long shadows across her garden, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. The lavender-scented letter was a puzzle, its pieces scattered across St. Mary Mead. The smudges, the scent, the impossible date all pointed to a deception, but one crafted with care. She recalled a case from years ago where a forged letter had nearly destroyed a family, its author betrayed by a single careless detail. People, she murmured to herself, are so predictable in their mistakes. Tomorrow she would visit the Reeds, and perhaps the vicarage again, to examine the letter more closely. The truth, she knew, lay in the details, the smudge of ink, the scent of lavender, the flicker of guilt in a nervous glance. St. Mary Mead might seem a quiet village, but beneath its surface, motives stirred like currents in a stream. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, was determined to trace them to their source. Chapter 4. The neighbour's shadow. The morning mist clung to the fields of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a gauzy veil that softened the edges of its cottages and lanes. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, set out for Willow Farm, her sturdy shoes crunching on the gravel path. The scandal of the lavender-scented letter had spread like wildfire, and the name of Thomas Reed, the farmer accused of an illicit affair with the late Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, was on every villager's lips. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be swayed by gossip. Her mission was to observe, to listen, and to uncover the truth hidden beneath the village's fevered whispers. Willow Farm lay at the northern edge of St. Mary Mead, its stone walls and sprawling fields a testament to generations of hard work. Thomas Reed, a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and broad shoulders, was known for his steady reliability. His wife, Margaret, was equally respected, her quiet demeanour and skill in the kitchen earning her a place at the heart of the village's social fabric. The letter's accusation had struck like a thunderbolt, threatening to shatter their reputation and their marriage. Miss Marple, carrying a jar of her homemade quince jelly as a pretext for her visit, approached the farmhouse with her usual blend of courtesy and curiosity. Margaret Reed answered the door, her face pale but composed, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes, usually warm, held a guarded wariness, and her hands, dusted with flour, betrayed a slight tremble. "Miss Marple," she said, managing a faint smile, "how kind of you to call. Do come in." The kitchen, where she led her guest, was warm and fragrant with the scent of baking bread, but there was an undercurrent of tension, as if the room itself held its breath. "I thought you might like some jelly," Miss Marple said, setting the jar on the table, "and I wanted to see how you're faring with all this talk in the village." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes missed nothing. The tightness in Margaret's jaw, the way her fingers twisted a dishcloth, the absence of Thomas's usual presence in the kitchen. Margaret murmured her thanks, offering tea, but her movements were mechanical, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. As they sat with steaming cups, Miss Marple steered the conversation delicately toward the letter. "It's a dreadful thing, this business with the letter," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "Such accusations must be terribly upsetting." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might not respond. Then, with a sigh, Margaret spoke. "It's nonsense, Miss Marple. Thomas would never, with Mrs. Grayson or anyone else. We've been married 20 years, and he's not that sort of man." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Of course, my dear. But the village does love its stories. Have you seen the letter yourself?" Margaret shook her head, her eyes dropping to her teacup. "No, but the vicar told us about it. He came yesterday, out of kindness, to warn us. Said it was from Mrs. Grayson, confessing to 2 things I can't believe." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Not doubt of her husband, perhaps, but of the situation's strangeness at that moment. Thomas Reed entered, his boots muddy from the fields, his face etched with exhaustion. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his usual hearty manner subdued. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "You've heard, I suppose. The whole village has sank into a chair, his large hands resting heavily on the table." Miss Marple observed his hands calloused, strong, the hands of a man who worked the land, not one likely to pen a delicate, lavender-scented letter. "I'm sorry for your troubles, Mr. Reed," she said. "It must be distressing to be so misjudged." Thomas's voice rose, then fell as he glanced at Margaret. "It's a lie, plain and simple. I barely spoke to Mrs. Grayson, except at church or the market, an affair. It's laughable if it weren't so cruel." His anger was genuine, but there was something else in his eyes, fear, perhaps, or shame at being the subject of such gossip. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, considered the dynamics of the room. Margaret's silence, Thomas's defensiveness there, was strain here, but not the kind born of betrayal. She turned the conversation to practical matters, asking about the farm's harvest, a topic that seemed to ease Thomas's tension. As he spoke of barley yields and the price of wool, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to a small bottle on the windowsill, its label reading lavender oil. It was an unusual item for a farmhouse kitchen, more suited to a perfumer's shop than a baker's domain. "That's a lovely touch," she said, nodding toward the bottle. "Do you use it in your cooking?" Margaret flushed, her hands stilling on the dishcloth. "Oh, that, I tried it once, for lavender shortbread. Mrs. Grayson gave me the recipe last summer. It didn't turn out well, so I kept the bottle for scenting linens." Her explanation was plausible, but the hesitation in her voice caught Miss Marple's attention. Lavender, again, its presence seemed to weave through this mystery like a persistent thread. The visit continued with small talk, but Miss Marple's mind was busy. The letter's accusation against Thomas seemed designed to wound, but to what end? She recalled a case from her youth, where a false rumor had been spread to distract from a theft. The lavender scent, so closely tied to Mrs. Grayson, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of her habits, someone like Harold Grayson, the nephew who stood to gain from her death. Yet Margaret's lavender oil raised another possibility. Could she, in a moment of jealousy or desperation, have crafted the letter? Miss Marple dismissed the thought almost immediately. Margaret's loyalty to Thomas was evident in her every gesture, and her hands, like her husband's, were not those of a forger. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple asked, almost as an afterthought, if either of them had seen Harold Grayson recently. Thomas frowned, rubbing his jaw. "He was here a week ago, asking about Mrs. Grayson's health. Said he was worried about her heart. I thought it odd he never struck me as the caring sort." Margaret nodded, adding, "He was in a hurry, always checking his watch." "I didn't think much of it then, but now." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple sensed a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, thanking them for their hospitality. Miss Marple stepped into the misty yard, her mind turning over the new information. Harold's visit to Willow Farm, his interest in his aunt's health, and the ink smudge on his cuff from her visit to Lavender Cottage formed a pattern, though its shape was not yet clear. The lavender oil in Margaret's kitchen was another piece of the puzzle, but Miss Marple suspected it was a red herring, a detail meant to confuse rather than clarify. As she walked back to the village, the mist began to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of St. Mary Mead's cottages. She passed the post office, where Clara Henshaw was sweeping the step, her face still flushed from the morning's gossip. Miss Marple paused to exchange pleasantries, subtly inquiring about any other unusual mail from Lavender Cottage. Clara shook her head, but mentioned a parcel Harold had posted the same evening as the letter addressed to a London firm. He was in such a rush, Clara said. I barely had time to stamp it. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A parcel, like the letter, suggested urgency, perhaps an attempt to cover tracks or secure assets. She made a mental note to ask Constable Hargreaves about it, though she suspected he would find little without her guidance. The constable, though diligent, lacked the imagination to see beyond the obvious, and this case, Miss Marple felt certain, was anything but straightforward. Returning home, she settled in her parlour with a cup of tea and her knitting, the click of her needles a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. The letter's purpose was becoming clearer, was not just a scandal, but a distraction, perhaps designed to shift attention from Mrs. Grayson's estate. Harold, as the heir, had the most to gain, but his nervous demeanour suggested he was not acting alone, or that he feared discovery. The lavender scent, so evocative of Mrs. Grayson, was a clever touch, but the smudged handwriting betrayed a lack of confidence, a hesitation that pointed to an amateur's hand. She thought, too, of the heirloom box at Lavender Cottage. Its presence on the mantel, dismissed so casually by Harold, nagged at her. Mrs. Grayson had cherished it, and Miss Marple knew from experience that such objects often held secrets, letters, wills, or keepsakes that revealed more than their owners intended. She resolved to examine it at the Women's Institute meeting, where she could do so without arousing suspicion as the afternoon faded into evening. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Reeds. Thomas's indignation and Margaret's quiet strength suggested a couple united, not divided, by the letter's accusation. Yet the strain in their home was palpable, a reminder of how easily trust could be shaken. She recalled a similar case in a neighbouring village, where a forged letter had driven a wedge between friends, all to conceal a financial scheme. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill, the sense that the truth was within reach, if only she could find the right thread to pull. The village clock chimed 6, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Tomorrow she would visit the vicarage again to study the letter's smudges more closely, and perhaps call on Dr. Haydock to inquire about Mrs. Grayson's health in her final days. The lavender-scented letter was a puzzle, its pieces scattered across St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple was patient. Like the mist that had cloaked the village that morning, the truth would eventually lift, revealing what lay beneath. For now, she contented herself with a final sip of tea, her mind as clear and sharp as the stars emerging in the evening sky. Chapter 5. The posthumous puzzled. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a tentative glow, as if uncertain whether to dispel the shadows of suspicion that had settled over the village. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out at her garden, where the dew glistened on the roses. Her mind, however, was far from the tranquil scene. The lavender-scented letter, with its impossible date and scandalous contents, had stirred St. Mary Mead into a frenzy, and Miss Marple's quiet curiosity was now a focused determination to unravel the truth. The letter's posthumous nature was the key, she felt certain. A puzzle piece that pointed to a deliberate act of deception. The village was abuzz with fresh speculation that morning, fueled by a revelation from the vicarage. The Reverend Clement, in a rare moment of indiscretion, had let slip at the butcher's shop that the letter's date scrawled in smudged ink was, unmistakably, the day after Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's death. This anomaly transformed the letter from a mere scandal into a mystery that captivated every gossip in St. Mary Mead. By mid-morning, the news had reached Miss Marple via her maid Lily, who recounted it with wide-eyed excitement. "There, saying it's a ghost, Miss Marple, a letter from beyond the grave." Lily's voice trembled with the thrill of it, but Miss Marple merely smiled, her thoughts already turning to more earthly explanations. She recalled a case from her youth in a neighbouring village, where a posthumous letter had turned out to be a clever forgery penned to secure an inheritance. The parallels were striking. A sudden death, a document that altered perceptions, and a beneficiary with a nervous disposition. Harold Grayson, Mrs. Grayson's nephew, was the obvious suspect, with his ink-stained cuff and hasty plans to leave the village. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to settle on the obvious. Human nature, she had learned, was a tapestry of motives, and the truth often lay in the overlooked details, the smudge of ink, the scent of lavender, the flicker of unease in a glance. Determined to examine the letter more closely, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, her shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting bag in hand as a pretext for the visit. The vicarage was a hive of activity, with Mrs. Clement organising a charity bazaar and the vicar buried in his study. Still shaken by the letter's implications, Mrs. Clement greeted Miss Marple warmly, her round face flushed from her efforts. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," she said, ushering her into the drawing-room. "This letter business has turned everything upside down. The vicar's been fretting all morning." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her eyes bright with interest. "It's a curious thing, isn't it?" she said, her tone mild. "A letter dated after Mrs. Grayson's passing, most unusual. Might I see it, if it's not too much trouble?" Mrs. Clement hesitated, glancing toward the study, but her trust in Miss Marple's discretion won out. She fetched the letter from a locked drawer, handling it as if it were a relic of some dark ritual. The envelope, cream-coloured and faintly scented with lavender, was as Miss Marple remembered from the post office. The handwriting, though elegant, was marred by smudges that obscured key phrases, giving the text an air of haste or distress. She held it to the light, noting the postmark's clarity. It was indeed stamped the evening after Mrs. Grayson's. The body was found. The letter itself, unfolded carefully, repeated the shocking confession of an affair with Thomas Reed, with a plea for the vicar's intercession. Yet something about the wording struck Miss Marple as odd, not the florid remorse, which was in character for Mrs. Grayson's dramatic style, but the phrasing of certain lines, which seemed almost theatrical, as if written by someone mimicking her voice. "The smudges are peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the blurred ink. "They're not random, you see. They cover specific words: affair, forgive, secret. It's as if someone wanted to ensure those stood out, even through the blur." Mrs. Clement, peering over her shoulder, frowned. "You think it's deliberate?" she asked. Miss Marple did not reply directly, but her eyes gleamed with the quiet satisfaction of a hunter spotting a trail. She asked the vicar, who joined them with a weary sigh, to confirm the date of Mrs. Grayson's death. "Dr. Haydock was quite clear," he said, adjusting his spectacles. She was found at 6 o'clock on Tuesday evening, already gone. The heart, he said. Miss Marple nodded, her mind calculating. The letter, posted Wednesday evening, could not have been written by Mrs. Grayson, unless she had risen from the graver notion. Miss Marple dismissed with a private smile. No, this was the work of a living hand, one with access to her stationery, a knowledge of her habits. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple decided to consult Dr. Haydock, whose surgery was a short walk away. The doctor, a brisk man with a nonsense air, was finishing his morning rounds when she arrived. He welcomed her into his cluttered office, where medical journals vied for space with a teapot and a tin of biscuits. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a chair, "I suppose you're here about Mrs. Grayson. Everyone's talking about that blasted letter." "Indeed," she said, her voice soft but probing. "I was wondering about her health in her final days. Was her heart condition well known?" Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. "Well known to me, yes. She'd had palpitations for years, and I prescribed digitalis to steady her heart. But she was careful, watched her diet, avoided stress. I was surprised it gave out so suddenly, to be honest." He paused, then added, "Her nephew, Harold, was asking about her medication last month. Said he wanted to be sure she was managing." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Harold's concern for his aunt's health, echoed by Thomas Reed's account of his visit to Willow Farm, suggested a pattern of inquiry that was less filial than calculating. "Did she seem distressed in her final weeks?" she asked. Dr. Haydock shook his head. "Not distressed, but preoccupied. She mentioned some family matters. Nothing specific, but she was revising her will, I believe. Said she wanted to do right by the village." This was a new thread, and Miss Marple tucked it away for later consideration. A will, especially one under revision, was a powerful motive, particularly for an heir like Harold, whose haste to leave St. Mary Mead suggested he had plans beyond mourning. She thanked Dr. Haydock and left, her mind turning to the heirloom box at Lavender Cottage. Its dismissal by Harold nagged at her, a detail out of place in a house where everything was meticulously arranged. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled, by the fire with her knitting, the click of her needles a steady rhythm as she sifted through the morning's findings. The letter's posthumous date was no accident. It was a calculated move, designed to shock and distract. But from what? The accusation against Thomas Reed seemed intended to sow discord, perhaps to draw attention away from Mrs. Grayson's estate or her intentions for it. Harold, with his nervous demeanour and ink-stained cuff, was the obvious candidate, but Miss Marple was wary of jumping to conclusions. She recalled a case from her days in London, where a forged letter had concealed a theft by casting blame on an innocent party. The principle was the same: misdirection, cloaked in scandal. She considered the lavender scent, so evocative of Mrs. Grayson. It was a clever touch, one that required access to her personal effects, her stationery, perhaps, or the sachets that filled her drawers. Margaret Reed's bottle of lavender oil came to mind, but Miss Marple dismissed it as a coincidence. Margaret's loyalty to Thomas was evident, and her hands, dusted with flour, were not those of a forger. No, the scent pointed closer to Lavender Cottage, where Harold had free rein. The heirloom box, too, was a lingering question. Mrs. Grayson's pride in it suggested it held something of value, perhaps not monetary, but personal. A will, a letter, a keepsake that revealed her true intentions. Miss Marple resolved to examine it at the Women's Institute meeting, where she could do so without arousing Harold's suspicion. She also decided to speak with Constable Hargreaves about the parcel Harold had posted, which might shed light on his motives. As evening fell, Miss Marple attended a parish meeting, where the letter was the inevitable topic. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes alight with excitement, cornered her with the latest gossip. "Jane, they're saying the letter was written by a ghost. Can you imagine? Poor Margaret Reed hasn't left her house, and Thomas looks ready to punch someone." Miss Marple listened patiently, noting the villagers' tendency to embellish. "It's a curious puzzle," she said, her tone mild. "But I suspect the answer lies in the living, not the dead." Back home, she sat by her fire, her knitting a pretext for thought. The letter's smudges, she realized, were not just a sign of haste, but a deliberate act to obscure meaning war, to suggest it. The ink, fresh and uneven, hinted at a hand unused to such subterfuge. Harold's cuff, stained with ink, was a clue, but not proof. She thought of the parcel he had posted, and the possibility that it contained documents related to Mrs. Grace's estate, a will, perhaps, or a letter that contradicted the lavender-scented confession. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Reeds, whose lives had been appended by the letter's accusation. Thomas's indignation and Margaret's quiet strength suggested a marriage under strain, but not broken. The lavender oil in their kitchen was a distraction, she decided, a detail that fit too neatly into the narrative of the letter. The real key lay in Lavender Cottage, in the box on the mantel, and in Harold's hurried plans to leave. As the village clock chimed 9, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Tomorrow she would visit Constable Hargreaves and inquire about the parcel, and perhaps call on Clara Henshaw again to confirm the postmark's details. The lavender-scented letter was a web of lies, its threads woven with care, but not without flaws. Miss Marple, with her patient eye for detail, was determined to find those flaws and pull them apart, revealing the truth that lay beneath the scent of lavender and the shadow of death. Chapter 6. The heir's ambition. The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a soft blanket of early autumn light, the golden hues of the season softening the edges of its stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped snugly against the morning's chill, made her way to Lavender Cottage for the Women's Institute meeting. The scandal of the lavender-scented letter had not abated. If anything, the revelation of its posthumous date had fanned the flames of gossip, turning every tea table into a court of speculation. Miss Marple, however, moved through the village with her usual quiet purpose, her mind fixed on the heirloom box that had caught her eye during her last visit. She sensed it held a clue, perhaps the key to unravelling the mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's death and the letter that had shaken St. Mary Mead. Lavender Cottage was abuzz with activity when she arrived. The Women's Institute, a stalwart of village life, had gathered to plan the autumn fete, and the parlour was filled with the chatter of women arranging stalls and debating jam recipes. Harold Grayson, Mrs. Grayson's nephew and heir, was present, though his participation was perfunctory. He stood by the window, his lean frame silhouetted against the light, sorting through a stack of books with a haste that suggested he was eager to be elsewhere. His eyes, restless and guarded, flickered toward the door whenever someone entered, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, like a man expecting unwelcome news. Mrs. Copling, the housekeeper, bustled about with trays of tea and scones, her face a mask of forced cheer. "It's good to keep busy," she said to Miss Marple, setting a cup before her. "Keeps the mind off things." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod, though her attention was drawn to the mantel, where the heirloom box still stood, its carved wood gleaming in the soft light. She had not forgotten Harold's dismissive remark about it, just a trinket, and her instinct told her it was anything but. The meeting proceeded with its usual mix of efficiency and gossip, the letter inevitably dominating the conversation. Mrs. Bantry, seated beside Miss Marple, leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "Jane, they're saying the letter was posted by a stranger someone from out of the village. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking rhythmically in her lap. She knew better than to trust such rumours. Strangers in St. Mary Mead were rare, and the letter's lavender scent pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Grayson's habits. Harold, with his access to the cottage, remained her primary focus. As the meeting broke for tea, Miss Marple seized her chance. With the other women distracted by Mrs. Copling's scones, she approached the mantel, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid drawing attention. The heirloom box was heavier than she expected, its lid fitting snugly with a faint click. She glanced over her shoulder. Harold was engrossed in a conversation with Mrs. Finch about the Fates raffle and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a velvet lining, was a folded sheet of paper, its edges worn but its handwriting clear and elegant. Unmistakably Mrs. Grayson's. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The paper was a draft of a will dated a month before Mrs. Grayson's death. Unlike the lavender-scented letter, it was unscented, its ink crisp and unmarred by smudges. It named a local charity, the St. Mary Mead Widows' Fund, as the primary beneficiary of her estate, with only a small bequest to Harold for his future endeavours. The implications were immediate and profound. Harold, expecting to inherit the cottage and its contents, stood to gain far less than he believed. Miss Marple closed the box carefully, her mind racing. The letter's scandal, she suspected, was a distraction crafted to obscure this very document. She returned to her seat, her knitting a pretext for thought, as the meeting resumed. Harold's behaviour took on new significance in light of the will. His haste to pack, his nervous glances, his presence at the postbox the evening the letter was posted all suggested a man desperate to secure his inheritance before the truth emerged. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth where a forged document had been used to discredit a rival heir. The principle here was similar: create chaos to conceal a truth that threatened one's gain. As the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered, engaging Mrs. Copling in conversation about Mrs. Grayson's habits. She was so particular about her things, Miss Marple said, her tone casual. That box on the mantel, that she often use it. Mrs. Copling nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. Oh yes, she kept her private papers there, letters and such, said it was safer than a drawer. I haven't touched it since she passed. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand. Noting that Harold had not mentioned the box's contents to the housekeeper, stepping into the garden, Miss Marple paused to inhale the lavender-scented air, her thoughts turning to the letter's purpose. Its accusation against Thomas Reed had served to inflame the village, drawing attention from the cottage and its contents. Harold, she suspected, had crafted it to cast doubt on his aunt's character, perhaps hoping to discredit any documents that contradicted his claim. The smudged handwriting, so unlike Mrs. Grayson's precise script, was a flaw in his plan, as was the ink on his cuff, a detail that lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a stubborn knot in her wool dot. Her next stop was the police station, a modest building where Constable Hargreaves was sorting reports with his usual methodical air. Miss Marple, under the pretense of inquiring about the fate's permits, gently steered the conversation to the letter. "Have you learned anything about the parcel Mr. Grayson posted?" she asked, her eyes bright with interest. Hargreaves frowned, flipping through his notebook. "Not much, I'm afraid. It was addressed to a solicitor in London. Something about estate papers," he said. "I've sent a query, but it'll take time to hear back." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the connection. A parcel to a solicitor, posted the same evening as the letter, suggested Harold was moving quickly to secure his claim. She thanked Hargreaves and left, her thoughts returning to the will in the heirloom box. If it was the final version, it would overturn Harold's expectations, leaving him with little more than a token sum. The letter, with its scandalous accusation, was a desperate gambit to shift focus, perhaps even to cast suspicion on Thomas Reed as a means of delaying scrutiny of the estate. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed Willow Farm, where Thomas Reed was mending a fence, his face set in a scowl. She paused to exchange pleasantries, noting his weary expression. "It's a hard time, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "This talk about the letter such nonsense." Thomas nodded, his hands tightening on the hammer. "It's tearing Margaret apart," he said. "She says she believes me, but I see the doubt in her eyes. Whoever wrote that letter wanted to ruin us." Miss Marple's heart went out to him, but her mind remained analytical. Thomas's hands, rough from years of labour, were not those of a forger, and his indignation was too raw to be feigned. The lavender oil in Margaret's kitchen, though a curious detail, was likely irrelevant, a gift from Mrs. Grayson, as Margaret had claimed, and not a tool of deception. The real deception, Miss Marple felt certain, lay with Harold and the cottage. Back in her parlour, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she sifted through the day's discoveries. The will in the heirloom box was a revelation, but it raised new questions. Had Mrs. Grayson intended to file it officially, or was it a draft she had kept private? Harold's ignorance of it, or his pretense of ignorance, suggested he had found it and sought to suppress it. The lavender-scented letter, with its smudged ink and impossible date, was his attempt to create a scandal that would overshadow the will's discovery. She thought, too, of the parcel to the solicitor. If it contained estate papers, as Harold claimed, it might be an attempt to establish a different version of the will, one that favoured him. Miss Marple recalled a case from a nearby village where a forged will had been sent to a solicitor to preempt the real one. The parallels were striking, and she resolved to ask Constable Hargreaves to expedite his inquiry about the parcel's contents. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village itself. Its quiet lanes and tidy gardens hid a multitude of motives: greed, fear, loyalty, and betrayal. Harold's ambition was clear, but his execution was flawed, betrayed by the smudges on the letter and the ink on his cuff. The heirloom box, with its hidden will, was the pivot on which the mystery turned, and Miss Marple knew she must protect its secret until she could confirm its authenticity. She decided to speak with the vicar again, to inquire about Mrs. Grayson's charitable activities. The Widow's Fund, named in the will, was a respected cause, and Mrs. Grayson's involvement with it might shed light on her intentions. She also planned to revisit Clara Henshaw to confirm the details of Harold's visit to the postbox. Every detail, however small, was a thread in the tapestry of truth, and Miss Marple was adept at weaving them together. As the village clock chimed 8, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind clear and focused, The lavender-scented letter was a lie, its purpose to obscure a greater truth. Harold Grayson, with his nervous haste and ink-stained cuff, was at its heart, but the full shape of his plan was still emerging. The heirloom box, with its hidden will, held the answer, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, step by careful step, until the mystery of Mrs. Grayson's death was laid bare in the light of St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. Chapter 7. The Smudge of Truth. The late summer sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the leaves to dapple the cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, pondered the threads of the mystery that had ensnared the village. The lavender-scented letter, with its scandalous accusation and impossible date, had stirred a tempest of gossip, but Miss Marple's mind was fixed on the heirloom box and the draft will she had discovered within it. The will, naming the St. Mary Mead Widows' Fund as Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's primary beneficiary, was a revelation that shifted the motive for the letter's forgery. Harold Grayson, the nephew and heir, was no longer merely a suspect, he was the linchpin of a scheme that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. The village was still reeling from the letter's implications. Thomas Reed, the farmer accused of an affair with Mrs. Grayson, had become a pariah. His broad frame stooped under the weight of whispers. His wife, Margaret, maintained a stoic front, but the strain in her eyes was evident to those who looked closely. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond the surface, knew that the letter's purpose was not just to wound the reeds, but to obscure a deeper truth. The smudged handwriting, the lavender scent, and Harold's nervous haste all pointed to a calculated deception, one that hinged on the contents of the heirloom box. Determined to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple arranged to revisit the vicarage, where the lavender-scented letter was kept under lock and key. She arrived mid-morning, her knitting bag in hand, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. Mrs. Clement, bustling with preparations for the upcoming fete, welcomed her warmly. "Jane, you're a godsend," she said, her cheeks flushed. "The vicar's been in a state over that letter. He says it's a moral quandary, keeping it from the parish." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but alert. "It's a delicate matter," she agreed. "Might I see the letter again? I've been thinking about those smudges." The vicar, summoned from his study, produced the letter with a weary sigh. He handed it to Miss Marple, who settled at the dining table with a magnifying glass she had brought for the occasion. The envelope, with its faint lavender scent, was unchanged, but the letter itself drew her full attention. The ink, black and glossy, was smudged in specific places around. The words affair, forgive, and Thomas, creating an impression of emotional haste. Yet under the magnifying glass, Miss Marple saw something new. The smudges were not random but layered, as if applied with a damp cloth to obscure underlying text. She tilted the paper to catch the light, her heart quickening, faintly visible. Beneath the smudges were traces of different words, written in a lighter hand. Dispute, debt, and repay emerged like ghosts, suggesting the original letter had concerned a financial matter, not a romantic one. The implications were immediate. The scandalous confession was a fabrication, overlaid on an existing document to mislead its readers. Miss Marple's mind flashed to Harold Grayson, whose ink-stained cuff and hurried demeanour marked him as the likely forger. "How very clever," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "and how very careless." Mrs. Clement, hovering nearby, caught the comment. "Careless, Jane. Do you think it's a fake?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild. I think it's a puzzle, my dear, and puzzles have a way of revealing their makers. She folded the letter carefully, returning it to the vicar with a request to keep it secure. Her next step was clear. She needed to confront the evidence of Harold's involvement, and that meant investigating the ink itself. Miss Marple's next destination was the police station, where Constable Hargreaves was reviewing reports with his usual methodical air. She greeted him with her customary courtesy, inquiring about the Fates' security arrangements before turning to the letter. "Constable," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "have you considered testing the ink on that letter? It might tell us when it was written." Hargreaves blinked, surprised by the suggestion. The ink. "Well, I suppose we could send it to the laboratory in Much Benham, but it's a bit of a bother." "Do you think it's important?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I think it might be, Constable. Fresh ink has a different sheen than old, and this letter's date is most curious." Hargreaves, though initially skeptical, agreed to send a sample for analysis, promising to expedite the process. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind already turning to the parcel Harold had posted the same evening as the letter. She asked if there was any news from the London solicitor, and Hargreaves shook his head. "Not yet, Miss Marple, but I've had a reply saying it was estate papers. Nothing specific." The lack of detail frustrated her, but Miss Marple was patient. She knew the truth often emerged slowly, like a flower unfolding in the spring. Decided to revisit Clara Henshaw at the post office, hoping to glean more about Harold's behavior that evening. Clara, still flustered by the villagers' obsession with the letter, was sweeping the floor when Miss Marple arrived. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her apron twisted in her hands. "It's been nothing but questions all day. Everyone wants to know about that letter." Miss Marple smiled, her presence calming the young postmistress. "I'm sure it's been trying, dear. I was wondering about Mr. Grayson's visit that evening. You said he was in a rush. Did he seem anxious?" Clara nodded, her eyes wide. "Ever so anxious. He came just before closing, posted the parcel, and then lingered by the post box, looking up and down the street like he was expecting someone. I thought it odd, but he's been odd since he arrived." This was a new detail, and Miss Marple filed it away. Harold's vigilance suggested he was aware of the letter's significance, perhaps fearing discovery. She thanked Clara and left, her thoughts returning to the heirloom box and its hidden will, the draft will favouring the widow's fund over Harold was a motive for forgery, but Miss Marple wondered if there was more to Mrs. Grayson's intentions. Had she discussed the will with anyone else? The vicar, as her confidant, might know. She called on the vicarage again that afternoon, finding the Reverend Clement in his garden, pruning roses with a distracted air. "Miss Marple," he said, setting down his shears, "you're a frequent visitor today. Still thinking about that letter?" She nodded, her expression serene. "I was wondering, Reverend, if Mrs. Grayson ever spoke of her plans for her estate. She was so devoted to the widow's fund." The vicar frowned, his spectacles glinting in the sunlight. "She did mention it, now you ask. A few weeks before she died, she said she wanted to leave a legacy for the village, something to help those in need. I assumed she meant a donation, but she was quite private about the details." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This confirmed the will's authenticity, but it also raised the question of who else knew of her intentions. Had Harold overheard, or found the draft by chance? Back home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she pieced together the evidence. The letter's smudged ink revealing a financial dispute beneath its scandalous surface, pointed to Harold's attempt to rewrite his aunt's narrative. The will in the heirloom box, hidden but not destroyed, suggested he had not yet secured his claim. The parcel to the solicitor, posted the same evening, might contain a forged will, one that named him as the sole heir. She recalled a case from a nearby town where a forged document had been sent to a solicitor to preempt the real one, only to be undone by a careless signature. Harold's smudges, she suspected, were his undoing. She considered the Reeds, whose lives had been appended by the letter's accusation. Thomas's anger and Margaret's quiet resilience suggested a marriage strained but intact. The lavender oil in their kitchen, though initially suspicious, was likely a coincidence, a gift from Mrs. Grayson, as Margaret had claimed. The real deception lay in Lavender Cottage, where Harold's ambition had driven him to forge a letter that would distract from the will's truth. Miss Marple decided to test her theory. She wrote a note to Constable Hargreaves, suggesting he compare the ink on the letter with any samples found in the cottage, particularly near Harold's belongings. She also asked him to expedite the inquiry about the parcel, suspecting it held the key to Harold's plan. The constable, though bemused by her persistence, agreed, accustomed to her uncanny knack for pointing him in the right direction. As evening fell, Miss Marple attended a village gathering at the church hall, where the letter remained the topic of choice. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes alight with excitement, pulled her aside. "Jane, they're saying the letter was written by a madman, or perhaps Mrs. Grayson's spirit, seeking justice." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "I think it's simpler than that, Dolly. People's motives are rarely supernatural." Mrs. Bantry laughed, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, tracing the threads of Harold's deception. The ink analysis, she knew, would confirm her suspicions, but the will in the heirloom box was the true prize. She planned to attend the next Women's Institute meeting at the cottage, where she could ensure the box's safety. Harold's haste suggested he might act soon, perhaps to destroy the will or replace it with a forgery. Miss Marple, with her quiet vigilance, was determined to be one step ahead. As the village clock chimed 10, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her thoughts as clear as the starlit sky. The lavender-scented letter was a lie, its smudges a mask for a financial dispute that threatened Harold's inheritance. The heirloom box, with its hidden will, held the truth, and Miss Marple was resolved to protect it. The mystery of Mrs. Grayson's death was nearing its end, and the smudge of truth, like a stain on a clean cloth, would soon be revealed in the quiet light of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The village of St. Mary Mead, bathed in the soft light of an early autumn afternoon, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Jane Marple prepared for a gathering at the vicarage. The lavender-scented letter, with its smudged ink and scandalous accusations, had woven a web of suspicion that entangled the entire community. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by the village's fevered whispers. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting basket, had pieced together the puzzle. The letter was a forgery, crafted by Harold Grayson to obscure the true will hidden in the heirloom box at Lavender Cottage. Armed with this knowledge, she resolved to bring the truth to light, and the vicarage, with its air of quiet authority, was the perfect stage. Miss Marple had spent the morning reviewing her evidence, her parlour a haven of calm amid the village's storm. The draft will, discovered in the heirloom box, named the St. Mary Mead Widows' Fund as Mrs. Eleanor Grayson's primary beneficiary, leaving Harold with a mere token bequest. The lavender-scented letter, with its false confession of an affair. With Thomas Reed was a desperate ploy to discredit Mrs. Grayson's character and delay scrutiny of her estate. The smudged ink, revealing traces of a financial dispute beneath the scandalous text, confirmed Harold's hand in the forgery, as did the ink stain on his cuff and his presence at the postbox the evening the letter was posted. The parcel he sent to a London solicitor, Miss Marple suspected, contained a forged will to secure his claim. She had shared her findings with Constable Hargreaves, who, though initially sceptical, had received a report from the Much Benham laboratory, confirming her suspicions. The ink on the letter was fresh, applied no more than a day before its discovery, far too recent to have been written by Mrs. Grayson before her death. The parcel, retrieved from the solicitor, contained a will naming Harold as the sole heir, but its handwriting was inconsistent with Mrs. Grayson's meticulous script. These pieces, combined with the hidden will in the heirloom box, formed a damning case against Harold, and Miss Marple knew the time had come to confront him. She arranged a tea at the vicarage, inviting a small group whose presence would ensure the truth emerged without chaos. The Reverend Clement, as the letter's recipient, was essential, his moral authority lending weight to the proceedings. Mrs. Clement, with her practical nature, would keep the gathering grounded. Thomas and Margaret Reed, the victims of the letter's accusation, deserved to hear the truth and clear their names. Harold Grayson, the key figure, was invited under the pretense of discussing the Fates charity allocations, a topic he could not easily decline. Constable Hargreaves, though not a guest, was asked to attend discreetly, ready to act if needed. The vicarage drawing-room was a picture of coziness, with chintz curtains and a fire crackling in the hearth. Mrs. Clement had set out a spread of sandwiches, scones, and her prized lemon drizzle cake, but the atmosphere was anything but festive. The Reeds arrived first, Thomas's face set in a scowl, Margaret's eyes shadowed but resolute. The vicar, his spectacles polished to a gleam, greeted them with a nervous smile, while Mrs. Clement fussed over the teapot, her chatter a thin veil over the tension. Harold entered last, his lean frame stiff with unease, his eyes darting to the door as if plotting an escape. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed the room with her usual quiet intensity. She began with pleasantries, complimenting Mrs. Clement's cake and asking Thomas about the harvest, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the undercurrent of suspicion. But as the tea was poured, she turned the conversation to the letter, her tone gentle but deliberate. "It's been quite a disturbance, hasn't it?" she said, her eyes resting on Harold. "Such a curious letter, with its lavender scent and smudged ink. I've been thinking about it a great deal." Harold's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer, but he managed a thin smile. "Village gossip, Miss Marple. It'll pass." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his forehead. She set her knitting aside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Oh, I don't think it's just gossip," she said. "The letter's date, you Seriton after. Mrs. Grayson's death makes it quite impossible, unless, of course, someone else wrote it." The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire suddenly loud. Thomas Reed's hands clenched, and Margaret's eyes widened, but they said nothing, waiting for Miss Marple to continue. The vicar adjusted his spectacles, his brow furrowed, while Mrs. Clement paused mid-pour, her teapot hovering. Harold's smile faltered, and he shifted in his chair. "That's nonsense," he said, his voice sharp. "Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice calm but unrelenting. Someone with access to Mrs. Grayson's stationery. Perhaps someone who knew her habits, her lavender scent. Someone who stood to lose if her true intentions were known. She paused, letting the words settle. I visited Lavender Cottage, you know, and saw that lovely heirloom box on the mantel. Mrs. Grayson was so proud of it. Did you ever look inside, Mr. Grayson? Harold's face paled, his fingers tightening on the arm of his chair. It's just an old box, he said, his voice strained. Nothing important. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. Oh, but it is important. I found a draft will inside, written in your aunt's hand. It left most of her estate to the widow's fund, not to you. Quite a surprise, I imagine, for an heir expecting more. The Reeds gasped, and the Vicars. Spectacles nearly slipped off his nose. Mrs. Clement set the teapot down with a clatter, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and Harold. Harold's composure cracked, his voice rising. That's absurd. You've no right to poke around my aunt's things. But Miss Marple was undeterred, her tone as gentle as if she were discussing the weather. I also noticed an ink stain on your cuff, Mr. Grayson, the day I visited, and Clara Henshaw saw you at the postbox the evening the letter was posted. The ink on the letter, you see, was fresh, far too fresh for Mrs. Grayson's hand. Harold's eyes darted to the door, but Constable Hargreaves, who had slipped into the room unnoticed, stood by the threshold, his notebook open. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The smudges on the letter were clever, but not clever enough. Beneath them, I saw traces of words: dispute, debt, repay. The original letter wasn't about an affair at all, was it? It was about a financial matter, perhaps one you didn't want known. So you rewrote it, using your aunt's stationery to create a scandal and distract from the will. Thomas Reed stood, his face flushed with anger. You mean this was all a lie, to ruin me and Margaret? His voice shook, and Margaret reached for his hand, her eyes fixed on Harold with a mixture of relief and fury. Harold stammered, his hands raised in protest. This is ridiculous. It was a prank, nothing more. I didn't mean any harm. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice cutting through his bluster. A prank? Then why the parcel to the London solicitor, sent the same evening? A forged will, perhaps, to secure your inheritance before the real one was found. Harold's face crumpled, and he slumped in his chair, his defiance draining away. I didn't want to lose everything, he muttered. She was going to give it all to that charity. I found the draft, and I thought, if I could make people doubt her, they'd question the will, too. The vicar gasped, his hand clutching his chest. You forged a letter to tarnish her memory, and implicated poor Mr. Reed. Harold's head bowed, his voice barely audible. I didn't think it would go this far. I just needed time to sort things out. Constable Hargreaves stepped forward, his expression grim. You'll need to come with me, Mr. Grayson. Forgery's a serious matter, and we'll need to look into your aunt's death further. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting resumed, as the room erupted in murmurs. Margaret. Reed's eyes filled with tears, but she held Thomas's hand tightly, her relief palpable. The vicar, recovering his composure, promised to safeguard the true will, while Mrs. Clement bustled about, offering more tea to steady everyone's nerves. Miss Marple, her work done, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The truth, like a skein of wool, had been tangled but not unbreakable, and she had unravelled it with patience and precision, dot as Harold was led away. Miss Marple reflected on the motives that drove him. Greed, she knew, was a powerful force, but it was often betrayed by carelessness. The smudged ink, the stained cuff, the haste to post a parcel. She recalled a case from her youth, where a forged letter had nearly robbed a family of their legacy, undone by a single misplaced comma. Human nature, she thought, was predictable in its flaws, and Harold's ambition had been no exception. The tea concluded, and Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. The village would talk of this for weeks, but the truth had restored a measure of peace. The reeds would heal, the widow's fund would receive its due, and Mrs. Grayson's memory would be honoured. As Miss Marple reached her cottage, the scent of her roses mingled with the evening air, a reminder that truth, like a garden, flourished. With care, she settled by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm, content that the lavender-scented letter had yielded its secrets at last. Chapter 9. The village restored. The soft light of a late September afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden hush, as if the village itself sighed with relief after the storm of the lavender-scented letter. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden, with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, watched the world with a serene contentment. The roses, though past their peak, still lent a delicate fragrance to the air, and the distant hum of village life children playing, the clatter of a cart spoke of a community settling back into its familiar rhythms. Harold Grayson's confession at the vicarage had unravelled the mystery, restoring truth where deception had sown discord, and Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, had been the thread that pulled it all together. The confrontation at the vicarage had spread through St. Mary Mead like ripples on a pond, each retelling adding a flourish until the tale rivaled the most sensational novels in Clara Henshaw's collection. Harold, under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but unrelenting evidence, the smudged letter, the ink-stained cuff, the hidden will in the heirloom box, had admitted to forging the scandalous confession to discredit his aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, and secure her estate. The true will, discovered in the carved wooden box, had named the St. Mary Mead Widows' Fund as the primary beneficiary, leaving Harold with only a modest bequest. His attempt to frame Thomas Reed for an affair had been a desperate bid to distract from this truth, but Miss Marple's keen eye had seen through the ruse. The village, though fond of its gossip, was quick to embrace the resolution. Thomas and Margaret Reed, freed from the shadow of the letter's accusation, had emerged from Willow Farm with renewed vigour. Thomas, his broad shoulders no longer stooped, was seen laughing at the market, while Margaret's kitchen once again rang with the cheerful clatter of baking. Their marriage, tested by the scandal, had proven resilient, and Miss Marple, who had visited them with another jar of quince jelly, noted the warmth in their glances, a silent testament to trust restored. The Widow's Fund, now poised to receive Mrs. Grayson's estate, became the talk of the Women's Institute. Mrs. Bantry, ever enthusiastic, had taken charge of organizing a special meeting to plan its allocation, proposing everything from a new almshouse to scholarships for the village's widows. Miss Marple, attending the meeting as a matter of course, listened with her usual quiet attention, her needles clicking rhythmically. She had no need to intervene. The fund was in capable hands, and Mrs. Grayson's legacy would be honoured as she had intended. Lavender Cottage, stripped of its former occupants' meticulous care, stood empty, its lavender bushes swaying unattended in the autumn breeze. Harold, after his confession, had been taken to the Much Benham police station, where he faced charges of forgery and possible further inquiries into Mrs. Grayson's death. Constable Hargreaves, diligent if unimaginative, had followed Miss Marple's suggestion to investigate the parcel Harold sent to the London solicitor. It contained, as she suspected, a forged will, its handwriting a clumsy imitation of Mrs. Grayson's precise script. The solicitor, alerted to the discrepancy, had returned the document, and the true will, found in the heirloom box, was now with the vicar, awaiting formal probate. Miss Marple, reflecting on the case, found herself drawn to the heirloom box itself. It had been the pivot of the mystery, a silent witness to Mrs. Grayson's intentions. The Women's Institute, tasked with cataloguing the cottage's contents for the charity, had invited Miss Marple to the fete where the box would be displayed. As a centerpiece, its intricate carvings a tribute to Mrs. Grayson's taste. She accepted the invitation, curious to see what else the box might reveal. Her experience had taught her that objects cherished by their owners often held secrets beyond the obvious, and Mrs. Grayson, a woman of precision, was unlikely to have left her legacy to chance. The fete, held on the village green, was a lively affair, with stalls offering jams, knitted scarves, and homemade cakes. The air was thick with the scent of cider and the laughter of children, a stark contrast to the tension of the past weeks. Miss Marple, dressed in her best tweed, moved through the crowd with her usual unobtrusive grace, pausing to admire a display of dahlias or to compliment a child's drawing. Her eyes, however, were drawn to the charity stall, where the heirloom box sat on a velvet cloth, its lid open to reveal a new discovery, a silver locket, nestled where the will had been. Mrs. Bantry, presiding over the stall, beckoned her over. With a grin, "Jane, look at this. We found it in the box this morning, tucked in a hidden compartment. Isn't it lovely?" The locket, engraved with delicate filigree, contained a miniature portrait of a man in naval uniform, Mrs. Grayson's late husband, Captain Grayson, whose memory she had cherished. Miss Marple's heart softened at the sight. The locket, unscented, and unmarred by the deception that had surrounded the letter, was a final glimpse into Mrs. Grayson's heart, a reminder that her life had been defined by love, not scandal. She turned the locket over in her hands, noting a faint inscription on the back, "To Eleanor, forever." It was a private token, one Mrs. Grayson had kept close, perhaps to remind her of the man who had shaped her life. Miss Marple handed it back to Mrs. Bantry, suggesting it be kept with the widow's fund as a memento of Mrs. Grayson's generosity. She would have wanted it cherished, she said, her voice soft but firm. Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes misty, and promised to see it done. As the fete continued, Miss Marple wandered to a bench beneath an oak, her knitting bag at her side. The village was healing, its wounds soothed by the truth. The Reeds, arm in arm at a nearby stall, were laughing over a child's attempt to win a goldfish. The vicar, his spectacles glinting, was judging a pie contest with an air of restored calm. Even Clara Henshaw, freed from the burden of the letter's discovery, was chatting animatedly with a customer at the post office stall. St. Mary Mead, for all its love of drama, craved order, and Miss Marple's quiet intervention had restored it. She reflected on Harold's downfall, a cautionary tale of greed undone by carelessness. The ink-stained cuff, the smudged letter, the forged will sent to London, all were signs of a plan hastily conceived and poorly executed. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth, where a young man's ambition had led him to forge a deed, only to be betrayed by a mismatched seal. Human nature, she thought, was a predictable tapestry, its flaws as clear as the knots in her wool. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Grayson, whose memory had been tarnished by Harold's scheme. The lavender scent, so evocative of her, had been a clever touch, but it was the locket, not the letter, that captured her true essence. Miss Marple wondered if Mrs. Grayson had suspected her nephew's ambitions, hiding the will in the box too. Protect her legacy. The widow's fund, with its promise of aid to the village's neediest, was a fitting tribute, and Miss Marple felt a quiet pride in having preserved it. As the fete drew to a close, Miss Marple joined the crowd for the raffle, where the heirloom box was awarded to Mrs. Copling. The housekeeper, as a token of her years of service, Mrs. Copling, her eyes brimming, clutched it tightly, promising to keep it polished. Miss Marple smiled, knowing the box's secrets had been revealed, its purpose fulfilled. She declined a second helping of cake, citing her digestion, and made her way home, the villagers' laughter fading behind her in her cottage. Miss Marple settled by the fire, her cat, Tuppence, curling at her feet. The lavender-scented letter was a memory now, its scandal dissolved by the truth. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking in a familiar rhythm, and reflected on the case. A little greed, a little lavender, she murmured to Tuppence, and the truth always surfaces. The village, like her garden, had weathered the storm, its roots deep and enduring. Miss Marple, with her unassuming wisdom, had ensured that St. Mary Mead remained a place where secrets, however cleverly hidden, could not withstand the light of day. As the village clock chimed 7, she set her knitting aside, her thoughts drifting to the next puzzle that might cross her path. For now, St. Mary Mead was at peace, its harmony restored by the quiet persistence of an elderly spinster who saw more than most. The locket, the will, the lavender were threads in a tapestry now complete, and Miss Marple, with a contented sigh, turned her attention to the roses, their petals a silent promise of the village's enduring calm.